Good morning and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim as we continue our journey with a prophet in Babylon, Chapter 11, Part B. He was recalled from his reveries by the voice of Palmer. "Well, that is something settled," he said, "and now for the second principle which should guide us. Here I know you won't hesitate even for a moment. You mustn't begin with the poor." Yes, there was no contradiction possible on that point, since all history proved that all great movements began among the poor. "You admit the principle too easily," said Palmer. "You'll find that very few people will agree with you, that in fact the trend of modern thought is all the other way. We don't object to pitying the poor and doing something for them if we have the opportunity, but who regards them as one class truly capable of new ideas? Yet it is really so. And that is why Jesus, with an infinite sagacity, went to the ranks of poverty for his apostles. Wesley did it too. All great reformers have done it. They knew that the sap rises from the root. We, less wise, imagine that the sap permeates downward from the branches. Can you mention any great reform that has begun among men of higher classes?" "I can think of none," said Gaunt. "But I can think of many movements which in the end were led by men of the higher classes." "In the end, yes, when the sap has risen. The fisherman comes first, however, and then the emperors." Gaunt laughed. "What a splendid professor of church history you would have made, Palmer." "I dare say," said Palmer. "I could have made it interesting. However, let me be serious on this point, because I regard it as vital. I don't want you to go to the poor out of pity. If you do, you will fail. I want you to have a genuine faith in the capacity of the poor for religious leadership, for then you will succeed. You've just got to believe in them, to recognize the potency that is in them, and you'll find that all sorts of influences will be exerted to draw you another way, and if you yield to them, you'll lose your battle." "What kind of influences?" asked Gaunt. "Well, your own aristocratic tastes, for one thing. Oh, you need not laugh. You know you've lived like an intellectual aristocrat for a good many years, and you've set up tendencies in your mind which are not easily destroyed. I never reflect without wonder on the sort of thing Wesley did, when I remember the sort of man Wesley was, for he was an intellectual aristocrat, if ever there was one. Scholarly and fastidious to a fault. Of course he had plenty of pity for the poor, as a man of his philanthropic nature would have. He had it even in his Oxford days. But it was not until he was flung pell-mell into the arms of the poor by the force of circumstance that he learned the lesson which made him the greatest religious reformer of modern times. What was that lesson? Why, just this, that the poor were more accessible to religious ideas and infinitely more capable of religious passion than all the gentlemen in England combined. So he took them with all their ignorance and lack of manners and made them preachers. He trusted them and learned to love them. He found them capable of the kind of heroism which the times demanded. He made the movement. They became its officers and leaders, and they amply justified his faith in them. By and by the movement permeated upward, the sap rose. But it began among the common people. It was generated in their crude enthusiasm, it succeeded by their sacrifice. And so the conversation ranged from point to point, and with each step Gaunt became more and more sure of himself. If Gaunt halted for a moment, Palmer spurred him on with ever new analogies and observations drawn from wide world knowledge and experience. Very few men of all those who know the details of Gaunt's subsequent career know how large a part Palmer had in shaping it, how this silent man, whose voice was hardly ever heard in public, watched over the soul of his friend with loving jealousy, and guided his course with the discretion of a large wisdom and a tireless love. A book is yet to be written on the silent friends of great reformers, the men who stood behind the scenes and were content to be unknown. If ever it is written, as it should be written, It will become one of the great books of the world. In these midnight conversations, the plans of the new movement were discussed and settled. In these discussions, Margret Gaunt took a large part, and here her practical intelligence proved of great value. Sometimes Gaunt chafed a little under her criticism, and good-humoredly remarked that her function was evident. It was to put the brake on the wheel, to which she replied, as gaily, that as long as she did not apply the brake when the coach was going uphill, he had little cause to complain. It was Margret Gaunt who insisted the movement must be started in some conspicuous way, because in New York, publicity was absolutely necessary to success. Palmer, in his enthusiasm for principles, was content to begin anyhow. He was indifferent about the exact point at which his lever should touch the world, being quite assured that once applied, the lever would do its work. Gaunt took the same view out of humility. The meanest kind of mission hall would have contented him, but Margret insisted against them both that a big idea must be interpreted in a big way. Ocean liners wanted sea room. She instanced Gordon. The League of Service was his idea, and there never had been a man better fitted to interpret it to the world. How was it, then, he had done nothing? Simply because he shut himself up in a little mission hall in an obscure district, as if he wished to be forgotten. He had spent all his sanctity and genius upon a few hundred of people, he who ought to have been the spiritual captain of thousands. "Listen to me," she said. "If Mayfield Avenue Church is too small for your ideas, how can you suppose that an obscure mission hall below 14th Street will be big enough? It's all very well to talk of small beginnings, but this is a day when small beginnings have small endings, too. Depend upon it, there's nothing so respected in New York as audacity. I don't worry myself whether New York is right or wrong, but I know that there's an excellent authority for not hiding a light under a bushel. Today there's no choice but to be conspicuous or be forgotten." "When Margret quotes scripture, there's no chance for me," laughed Gaunt. "It's a very good scripture anyhow," retorted Margret. "I never did believe that there was much virtue in humility, at least in that kind of humility that makes men do little things because they're easier to do than great things. That kind of humility looks to me rather like cowardice." They argued the matter a long time, until at last Margaret's view prevailed. For the longer they studied it, the more sound and sagacious did it appear. Undoubtedly it was true that New York respected only big ideas, which were interpreted in a big way. It was characteristic of that megalomania which infected all the thought of the city. It was a city of immense industries, businesses, and trading corporations, and the power of each had been built upon the widest kind of publicity. Politics were guided in the same instinct. The politician took care to engage the largest halls, to address as many thousands as he could reach, to organize an adequate press report for his ideas. Why should the children of light be less energetic and sagacious than the children of this world? Here was an idea far greater than politician had ever uttered, a scheme that would mean far more in the national life than half a century of politics had meant, a reconstitution of the entire religious life of the people, the creation of a spiritual confederacy which would in time dominate both politics and government, and perhaps supersede them. And did not this also demand publicity of the widest kind? It was a grandiose conception, to flash a new idea, a living and transforming thought, simultaneously upon the mind of the entire nation, to write it upon the heavens, as it were, so that no man in the loneliest backwood or the most distant city should be able to escape its message, and then for America to become the religious leader of the world, to give the world the final church, which should include all people and absorb all religions, and should be indestructible because it was based on pure, eternal truth. Well, if this final triumph was never reached, still this should be the aim. And to reach this aim, even to take the first step toward it, there must be a scheme of action full of daring, which the world could not ignore. "We must begin at Madison Square Garden," Margret said, with quiet emphasis. At this, both Gaunt and Palmer vehemently dissented. They declared such an idea impossible and absurd. But Margret was not discouraged. She went on to impress her ideas with such clearness and precision that at each stage they appeared more and more practicable. It was the most central public building in New York. Poor and rich could reach it easily, and it was the kind of building from which the poor would not be deterred. It was probable that the poor could be better reached and in larger numbers in the vast auditorium associated with every form of pleasure than in any hall of less commanding reputation in their own exact neighborhood. It was said that no human voice could be heard in it, but that was nonsense, since politicians spoke there constantly. Then the very vastness of the venture would appeal to the imagination of the city. People would throng to the hall in thousands out of mere curiosity, if for no better reason. And so the League of Service would be created in a day. At the first sound of the trumpet, an army would respond to the call. And then the press, an omnipotent organ of publicity, unable to ignore an event so wonderful, and itself perhaps converted to the ideas of the League, would disseminate those ideas from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and they would pass around the world, like seeds blown by a great wind, which fall into 1,000 soils, and belt the globe with verdure. Yes, she concluded, the big thing is always more practical than the little one. I have much more faith in you than you have in yourselves, faith enough to believe that you will succeed. And so Margret really became the prophetess of the new movement. As objections arose, she overcame them one by one, buoyed up by her faith. Perhaps in the bottom of her heart she would still have preferred the old quiet ways, but having once renounced them, her surrender to the new idea was complete. If we are to be poor, we may as well be poor to some purpose, she said. Let us sell everything we have and make the venture. And so one night in Gaunt's quiet library, the last touches were put on the great scheme, and the last sacrifice determined on. They resolved to ask no one for money for its initiation. By the sale of their property and the realization of a few securities which they had, the Gaunts calculated they could raise a few $1,000s. Palmer, fired by their example, was ready to turn into cash about $50,000 worth of investments, which represented the savings of a lifetime. With this capital at command, they could make a start, and for the rest they would have boundless faith. If they failed, they would have the consolation of knowing that it was in a great cause, but their faith thrived upon their sacrifice, till each reached the sublime optimism of the enthusiast, who regards failure as impossible. And that's the end of chapter 11. Next week we'll continue with chapter 12, Farewell to the Old. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.